Amen. Thank you, brother. You know, something that Stacy just mentioned in his prayer, that we get taught. We get taught the word, and it's something that we, going through the lesson and understanding what Galatians is all about. And a lot of us already know what it is and what they went through, but these are the things that we should do. We should be reminding ourselves of everything that we're studying again, because there's times that when we look at these verses, there's certain things that pop out, and we might look at it from a different angle. But for sure, something that we'll always continue to do throughout our lives is continue to study the same thing over and over, so we can get more rooted, more grounded. But going to Galatians 4, verse 21 and 22, Brother Mark, can I get you to read 21 and 22 for us?
Tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do ye not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham and two sons, the one by a bondmaid and the other by a free woman.
Okay, so immediately, when he says, tell me, you think of, Paul basically is saying, after I tell you about this, or after I teach you about what I'm about to teach you, you're going to have to answer this question, either to him or to themselves. And this is how the Word of God works in our lives, because when we hear a sermon, then we have to answer it in our own minds to see what it is that he's trying to tell us. He says, you who desire to be under law. And he just got done saying, tell me, you who desire to be under law. So he's asking them, are you sure you understand the law and what it really stands for? Have you really read and have you listened to it in its fullness, is what he's trying to get them to understand. So he's challenging them to see if they actually know what the law requires in its entirety. There's a lot that goes with the law. If you ever gone back and read the whole law in Leviticus, man, there is a lot there that needs to be done over and over and over. And you can think about now, 2 Timothy 2:15, even for us. We are to study to show thyself approved. And that's what they needed to make sure they were doing. Because he says, you who desire. So those that were wishing to be under that law, the Mosaic law, are the ones that were being influenced by the Judaizers. I mean, that's been the theme throughout this whole book. But whenever he says, you who desire, that makes you kind of think, well, maybe not everybody in the Galatian area was going with the Judaizers. There may have been a lot that were, and then there were some that were not. They were not being influenced by all this false teaching. But of course, some did desire those teachings. And again, he says, do you not hear the law? So pay attention to what it says. When Paul says hear, that means to listen carefully with giving intentions to follow or heed the law. Just like us, when we hear the word, we have to listen carefully so that we will also be willing to do what it says that we should be doing. There in verse 22, it says, for it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the bondwoman and the other by the free woman. So now we see Paul, he's going to give the Galatians an illustration on how the law of Christ and how the law and Christ are different. One, of course, is of bondage, and the other one is of freedom. And he's going to use, as an illustration, Abraham's family to prove this point. And Paul is going to use what is written. And he's going to take Genesis chapter 16 through 21 to prove the point to the Galatians. And basically focusing on freedom and in bondage. And so we know that anytime we read in the New Testament, when it says, for it is written, what does that automatically make us think of? The Old Testament, right? And so what is it for? When you say for it is written, it's because it bears witness to what he's about to say. It's, I was thinking about that when it bears witness. It's no different than when you're in a court of law and you have a witness that comes with you, and you say, well, I was here, I was there, and they can't really. How are you going to prove that? you have the witness that'll bear the truth and say, yes, I saw him there. And so this is what the Old Testament does for us. It really settles or concretes everything that he's about to say. And so he says here, we're going to be talking about the bondwoman and the free woman. So who are the two sons of these women? Isaac and Ishmael, right? Okay, Ephraim's gone through that. I told me we intersected somewhere in his teaching in this, but which is great. And so then the mothers, who are the mothers? Hagar and Sarah. So we have Ishmael and Isaac, right? Both being sons of Abraham, but from the different mothers. And these two women had different roles. One, of course, we know was a slave and the other was free. So this is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to have some comparisons here, something that we can think about. So we have Judaism on one side and we have Christianity on the other side. And over on the Judaism side, you can think of the bondwoman, which is Hagar. And on the Christianity side, you see the free woman as being Sarah. And then the bondwoman's son, Ishmael, over on the Judaism. And then you have Isaac on Christianity. And we know that on the Judaism, also the son of Hagar, that came from a natural birth. She was just a younger woman, so there was nothing miraculous about that. She was just born. He was just born by natural birth. And then on the side of Christianity, we have supernatural birth that was given by promise, because we know that Sarah was very old at the time she had Isaac. And you have Judaism, Mount Sinai, which is the law of Moses. You have Mount Zion, the law of Christ as far as Christianity. And then eventually, the Judaism enslaves and Christianity frees. And these are the things that we're going to see in the next few verses as we go through this study. So verse 23, let's read verse 23. Viviana, can you read verse 23 for us? In Galatians 4 and verse 23. Okay, so we can ask a question here. What prompted the birth of Ishmael initially? Sarah did what? Okay, right? Yes. Yes, that's a good point, right? So and she did all that so that she could obtain children by her. And we find that in Genesis 16 and verse 2. But according to the flesh, these are just natural laws of procreation, right? Genesis 16:4 says that Abraham was with Hagar and then that she became pregnant. So there was no kind of divine intervention there. But the one through promise, Isaac, was born after the age of procreation for the mother Sarah. And this was, of course, contrary to whatever is considered natural, right? It was by a promise.
Sarah couldn't have children.
She was barren. Even on top of that, that's right. Thank you for that point, because she was already old, and number one, she couldn't have any children anyway. She was barren.
Another way of looking at that being the bondwoman or Ishmael being born according to the flesh,
Mm-hmm.
and Isaac being born according to the promises, is the flesh being according to the will of man, and then Isaac being born according to the will of God.
Yes, very good. Thank you for that. Yes, it is. Okay, so now we know that at what age was the promise given to Abraham? Do y'all remember that? The promise, when he was given the promise about becoming a father. About 75. At first, when he was given the promise initially, right, for going out and that through the nations, all nations will be blessed. Originally, now, when did he have Isaac? At what age? 25 years later. 25, right? 100, and then she was 90. We can find that in Genesis 17 and 17. Let's go there and read that really quick. Genesis 17 and verse 17. Isela, can you read that for us? Genesis 17, verse 17.
Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?
Okay, so even though we're not talking about him laughing and all that, but that's getting up there in age. Now let's go to Genesis 18, 11, and 12. Genesis 18, verses 11 and 12. Ivan, can I get you to read that for us? Okay, so she had passed the child after she had passed the age of childbearing, and the point that Sister Alicia, yeah, she was barren, and I think she was made fun of by Hagar because she couldn't bear any kids. But okay, so we have a man that's 100 years old, a lady that's 90 years old, and they have a son. I looked it up just to see. I guess you just look it up on any website and say who is the oldest woman to have a natural childbirth. And I think that the age it gave is 59 years old. And that is getting up there in age because most ladies are way less than that. Now, but there's others that have this IVF, they're up in their 70s and all that. But regardless of that, is at this point, for a woman to be able to have a child, it had to be divine intervention by God. There's no way that she could have done that. And verse 10 of Genesis 18 said, God tells Abraham, I will return to you and Sarah will have a son. So God promised, God intervened, and God delivered. Anytime God says anything to us, make sure that we understand that it will come to pass. There's no doubt in whatever he does tell us. Anybody got anything else before we move on to the next few verses? Okay, let's look at verse 24 and 25. Pam, can you read that for us? Galatians 4, 24 and 25.
This is allegorically speaking, for these women are two covenants, one proceeding from Mount Sinai, bearing children who are to be slaves. She is Hagar. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children.
Okay, thank you. So whenever it says these things are an allegory or allegoric or symbolic, did anybody look up that word or knows what an allegory is? Can y'all share it with the class? Okay, so I had to look it up. I mean, I wouldn't have known immediately, right? So to me, the few definitions that I got, it says it's a story in which people, things, or happenings have a different meaning, a hidden meaning. It's used as a form of comparison to convey something symbolic. And this is what Paul is going to use Bible history or as a background or as an allegory to point out a parallel meaning is what this means, right? He's going to do this for the Galatians so they can kind of understand it. And it kind of makes you kind of think of Jesus whenever he used to use parables to get people to understand what exactly he was talking about. If you look up allegory examples, it'll tell you the tortoise and the hare. Remember the tortoise that was really slow, and then you had a rabbit that's super fast?
I was just going to say, my version says in verse 24, which things are symbolic.
Symbolic.
These are the two covenants.
Yes, symbolic is the other word that's the same as allegory. So that's what we're going to see, that's how Paul is going to use the verses that he's using to prove a point to the Galatians. So he starts off by saying for these are the two covenants. Hagar represents one covenant, Sarah represents the other covenant. And these two covenants are different. Remember, it's two different women. So the old covenant is who? And what we just talked about. Hagar. And the new covenant? Sarah, right? Let's go over to Jeremiah. We're going to read here in Jeremiah, chapter 31. Jeremiah 31, 31 through 34. This is where Jeremiah is talking about the changing of the covenants. Jeremiah 31, 31 through 34. Ephraim, if I could get you to read that for us. Jeremiah 31, 31 through 34.
Behold, the days are the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, though I was a husband to them, says the Lord. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it in their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. No more shall every man teach his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, says the Lord. For I will give their iniquity and their sin I will remember no more.
Okay, so that's where you see Jeremiah foretelling of the changing of the covenant. And I'll just read Hebrews 8 and verse 13. Hebrews 8, 8 through 12 basically says the exact same thing here, but in Hebrews, in verse 13, this is added. It says, in that he says, a new covenant. He has made the first obsolete. Now what is become obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. Just another proof of saying the law of Moses is obsolete. It's out. We don't use it no more. It's going to be done away with. And then the verse continues to say back in Galations, it says, the one from Mount Sinai which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. So now Paul, we're going to see him actually identify each woman. We already talked about Hagar signifies the law of Moses, which was given on Mount Sinai. So the law gives birth to children that are destined to be slaves to it. Remember, because Paul is telling them, if you're going to do this, you better do it to the fullest. Which, of course, it couldn't be done. But still, the fact was that they were to follow the whole thing. So we kind of see the connection there. Just like Hagar was a slave to Abraham, so that means that anybody that was born to Hagar would also become slaves. Basically, become slaves to the law. And this is what this allegory represents. Hagar as the law, and it left man in bondage to keep the whole law perfectly. And when we read there at the very end, it says, and corresponds to Jerusalem, which is now and is bondage with her children. Another word for corresponds is answereth to Jerusalem, which is now. And when you look up that word answereth, defined, that means to file together as soldiers. In other words, to stand in a line, to stand and march in the same row. And it really makes sense to be parallel with. So you see that this part of the verse, what it's talking about, and it shows that Mount Sinai, Ishmael, and Hagar stand on the same side. Basically, if you can picture that in your mind, and not on the side of Isaac, because Isaac is completely different. And when he says Jerusalem, which is now, what does that mean? Jerusalem, which is now. The physical Jerusalem, the actual physical place at that time, which is now. He's just referring that to. So the law of Moses was earthly in a sense, as Hagar stands for Judaism at the physical city of Jerusalem, is what that means. And is in bondage with her children. So the law leaves all Hagar's children, in a state of spiritual bondage. So she and her children represented the old covenant. This is kind of, going through this lesson, I was like, man, this is really like reaming me out. But it's good, when you get to define words, you get to go through this and you see what Paul is meaning, or at least we're trying to represent what it is that he's saying through God speaking through him. So it's really good. Okay, so then we go to Galatians 4 and verse 26. 4 and verse 26. Debbie, can you read 4:26 for us? Yes.
But the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all.
Okay, thank you. So what we already discussed what Jerusalem, the present Jerusalem is. So what is this Jerusalem above? Kingdom of God, spiritual, yes. You know, it's the heavenly Jerusalem. It's the church. It's the children of promise. And it's free because Sarah was free. You know, Christianity, to become a child of God, doesn't cost us anything. We have to give up the old man has to die and then start living for Christ. But that's what it is. So Paul just got finished speaking about the present physical Jerusalem and how that meant that was bondage. But this other Jerusalem, the one from above, is free. And we know that it is already in existence because Christ had already come and he had died, he had resurrected back to the Father. That's what that means for us. So, you know, we ask the question, who will be those who inhabit this Jerusalem from above? Who's going to be there? Those that obey. People of faith, right? Those that took the steps to be forgiven of their sins. You can even, in the context, descendants of Sarah. So we are all heirs of the promise that was given to Abraham, which is mother of us all. The mother of all Christians, of course, it's figurative language, but those that belong to this free Jerusalem, which should be everybody that is sitting in this room, Jew and Gentile, both that obey the law of Christ. Okay, so we're going to now read verse 27. Verse 27. Alicia, can I get you to read verse 27?
For it is written, Rejoice thou, barren, thou carest not, break forth and cry, thou that travailest not, for the desolate hath many more children than she which hath.
Okay, so, we know that Paul is quoting there from Isaiah 54 and 1. That might be on the side of your note because that's word for word what is over there in Isaiah. So he's making application to Sarah and to Hagar. And we know that Sarah could not bear any children, right? We knew that. That's what we've been reading. But then here comes Isaac, right, at the age of 90. So then it says there, rejoice, O barren. In other words, Sarah, now that you are barren, now you can rejoice because now you have the son of promise. You know, and when it says break forth and shout, now, you think, oh man, is that in childbirth that she's in pain? No, this is not what it means. This means that she is to be happy. This is a shout of happiness, of joy, because now the promise has been fulfilled. That's why it says shout, break forth and shout. And then when it says you who are not in labor, and remember we talked about this a couple lessons back, when a woman travails in labor, it's extreme pain. But Sarah, in the way it's reading it here, she was not in pain when she bore the numberless sons and daughters that you think about, all of us that are still here now. Because we really are descendants of her, talking about through Christ. So she didn't have that pain, even though she had a few sons, but now we are all here. So you think about it, Sarah ended up having far more children than Hagar in that spiritual sense. Because now you have Jews, you have Gentile believers. And even then, I think I read a lot where there's probably a lot more Gentile believers than there was Jews at the beginning when they were all being converted. There was just, everybody was hungry for the word. And so they were outnumbered by a lot. And then we remember then the thing that God told Abraham, through your seed, all And that's the word, little bitty word, all, A-L-L. But that is probably the most important word in that whole verse. All the nations of the earth shall be blessed. And you think of, he says the earth. That's everybody that is alive right now. So we know that there was many that believed and are still being converted to Christ. Let's read Mark 16, 15, and 16. Mark 16, 15, and 16. Teddy, can you read that for us? 15 and 16.
It reads, after he said to them, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but who does not believe will be condemned.
Okay, so of course we know that's a commandment to the apostles to go out and preach the word. We have the parallel passage in Matthew 28 and 18, but it's still happening. That commandment was given to them. That's what you and I still do. We take the time to study with our friends, with our neighbors, or whoever it is, and we're still spreading that gospel. We're still giving that free gift of Christ to everybody that will listen, and that's still happening. And that's why it says, for the desolate has many more children, meaning Sarah, right? And then it says, then she who has a husband. So Hagar seemed to have the husband since Sarah was barren, right? Because she's the one that bore the first Ishmael, Abraham's first son. But we have to remember that Sarah was a lawful wife. And so Hagar is basically a second wife that was a maidservant. That's how we understand what that means. Does anybody else have anything else that they may have studied on this verse before we move on to the next few verses? Ephraim mentioned this verse to me while we were discussing this, but in Genesis 16:3, it says, then Sarah, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abraham to be his wife after Abraham had dwelt 10 years. So it kind of seems like, it might be referring kind of back to that. I wasn't quite sure if the connection was there, but it does say that Sarah gave Abraham Hagar to be his wife. Whatever sense that was. But anyways, that's just anything you think about on that, Sean? No?
I think it's connected to just the fact that she was for the purpose of bearing a child.
Yeah.
Just like the handmaidens were given to Jacob from his wives Leah and Rachel.
Mm.
It was for that purpose of bearing children. They were not wives in the sense that Sarah and Abraham
Right.
married,
Mm-hmm.
but wives in the sense of there for the purpose of bearing children.
Producing.
Kind of like concubines
Right.
that the kings had. They had children by those concubines. The kings did, but they were not, in the typical classic sense, married as husband and wife.
Okay. Yeah, and that's good. That does make.
Hagar was cast out,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and Abraham had to cast her out.
Right. Yeah. That's.
And his son went with her.
It,
His son, and that was hard, but
it was. It's a good point, and we're about to get to that casting out. That does sound really rough. It's. I mean, it's just stuff that had to happen, Brother Jose.
Brother Arthur, I was looking at why the Apostle Paul goes through all this trouble, going back so many years of history.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's trying to give these Christians, that now being a Christian now try to go back to the law. And then he goes so many years back and trying to get them to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And my point is that looking at him, I see it once again here, how he's trying to teach these Christians
Mm-hmm.
or make them understand. And I guess I can say that sometimes, if we try to, let's say I'm trying to go back to my religion, where I used to
Right.
Like me, to know the history why I was a Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
And I did. I went back and studied before, when people was trying to get baptized and knew the gospel. I went on a study. I said, why am I a Catholic? Where this religion come from? That's what Paul's doing. He's taking these people back and tell them, hey, here's how it started. If we ever trying to preach somebody the gospel, it will help if we know a little bit of history
Oh yeah, that's a good
how
point. Yeah.
we helped him.
Yeah, for it is written to bear witness. That's what you bring to the table to explain to somebody where you came from, where it was. Did anybody else have another point? Okay, let's read verse 28 and 29 of Galatians 4. Verse 28 and 29. Joey, can I get you to read that for us?
Galatians 4:28-29.
Yes.
Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise. But as he who was born according to the flesh, then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now.
Okay, thank you. So all Christians now are children of promise. All Christians, remember, are the children of promise. So Isaac's birth followed the fulfillment of that promise. And this is why Paul could assure those Galatians that they too are the children of promise, children of Abraham. This is, and if we read back Galatians 3 and verse 7, let's go back and read Galatians verse 3 and verse 7. Galatians 3 and verse 7. And I'll read that. It says, therefore, know that only those who are of faith are sons of Abraham. So he's just reminding them the Galatians had true faith, and that's what made them the sons of Abraham. And of course, we're talking about this is in a spiritual sense, but that's what he's telling them. Verse 29 says, but as he who was born according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now. So, we're talking about the two boys, Abraham's sons right here. You have Ishmael that was born first, and then you have Isaac. So let's read Genesis 21 verses 8 through 10. Genesis 21 verses 8 through 10. Gabriel, can I get you to read that for us?
So the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom he had borne to Abraham, scoffing. Therefore she said to Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac.
Okay, so there's the rough part of this, right? It says Abraham made a great feast when Isaac was weaned. So it talks about how Ishmael, she saw him scoffing. What's another word for scoffing? Mocking. Yours says what, Alicia? Mocking. To laugh outright is another way of looking at that. To make sport of. He's just basically coming down on the boy. And so here's a rivalry in a sense. You think of the two. You have Ishmael, the firstborn, and he's realizing after this great feast that this boy Isaac is going to deprive him of anything that he may have coming. I mean, we're looking into that, or I'm just kind of making an assumption that can be happening. But this is what happens sometimes between brothers and sisters when one sees something going out the door, and then somebody else inheriting something that they wanted. So Ishmael did not like that. After that great feast, he begins to scoff or persecute his half brother Isaac. And you think about, remember the prodigal son? When he left and he came back, and then he was mad because the dad made a great feast for him also. He was upset and all mad. It just made me think about that reading also whenever I was going through this. But now, let's ask a question. Who's responsible for all this mess? Sarah? How can you blame the mother? I thought mothers were supposed to love their children. But no, it is true, right? Sarah brought this upon herself. Why did she bring this upon herself? Lack of faith, not waiting on the Lord. I don't know. It's one of those things. So you see her as, now that she has a son, off with Hagar, off with Ishmael. This is the hard reality of it. Brother Sean alluded to this. But this is what happens. This is what happens when we as a people decide that, well, I think God needs some help. And we'll see this in all kinds of areas in our lives. Not even just in a day to day, but even in the realm of other religions, on how they will take things a little bit further to try to say, well, this is better for God. I know He told me do this, but I think, He told me to build this, but I think I'm going to put gold all the way around here and put some lights on here. It's not what God asked for. We do what God tells us. Brother Jose?
Well, I think for me as Abraham too, he's to blame for this. I mean, you brought up that, brother and sister, if they have a problem, my mom will say, well, my wife, hey, you take care of that.
Mm-hmm.
We got to stand up and, hey, I think it was his fault, for not stepping up his, I don't know, that's the way I see it.
No, yeah. No, of course, it would be. There was multiple people that were at blame here. It wasn't just her, but now she initiated it, and he just followed through, just like when Eve ate the fruit and said, here, husband takes it. Okay, dummies.
I don't think patience is one of the prevalent qualities of mankind from the get-go.
Yeah.
We're all like that. We start when we were little kids. We would see something we want it now.
Yeah.
And we don't care how many people we bug trying to get it, and some people grow out of it and some people never do.
Yeah, that's true. It's a human tendency, isn't it? Yeah, to wait 25 years, that's a long time, right? But remember, the promise was there. Brother Sean?
Well, you go back to, we read Genesis 16 a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
When Sarah gave Hagar to Abram, she said to him, please go into my maid, perhaps I shall obtain children by her. And Abram heeded the voice
Of his wife, yeah.
Okay. Now we fast forward to what we just read there at the weaning
Mm-hmm.
of Isaac, and what God says to Abram there: heed the voice of your wife.
Mm-hmm.
Cast out that woman.
Yeah.
Let's return back to my will.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
That's what's going on here.
Right.
Abraham was complicit with Sarah in lack of faith and doing things man's way.
Right.
And so he heeded her voice. Then God says, when Sarah said, cast out this woman, God says, yes.
Do it.
Heed your wife's voice. What she's saying is right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Let's go back to my will, my plan.
Yes, go back to it. Yeah, so that's the thing. If none of that would have happened if they'd have just followed. But now that it's to this point, God says, you have to do it now. It has to be done. When he talks about even so it is now, and here's the point that he's talking to the Galatians about. He's telling them these Judaizers are in line with Ishmael is what's happening. They are doing the very same thing that Ishmael did to Isaac. They are persecuting them in asking them to follow them under this circumcision and following the law. Remember, in the previous class, we talked about how they zealously court you, but not for a good thing. That's exactly what is happening here. So Paul is saying to them that these Judaizers are just causing them trouble. Okay, so that's where we'll finish with that part. Now, verse 30 and 31. Let's read those last two verses, verse 30 and 31. Gracie, can you read that for us? Galatians 4:30 and 31. Okay, so this, thank you. The slave woman has to be out. She has to be cast out. That way it gives place to the lawful wife. And this, we know we discussed that it's a little rough in how it comes out, but this is how Paul is using this as an allegory, as an example to say the covenant of Mount Sinai, the law of Moses, it has to be done away with. It has to be cast out, just like Hagar and Ishmael were cast out. It has to be taken out to give place for the new covenant that was given to Abraham and his seed to be fulfilled in Christ.
And by extension, Paul is telling the Galatians, reject their teaching.
Reject their teaching.
Cast
Yes.
it out. It is false teaching. Reject it. Cast it out.
Yes, you have to, and you know, and you think about that even for us now. If the same thing is happening here at Crescent Park or anytime, we have to do the same thing. If it's false teaching, we have to cast it out because it'll infiltrate, it'll come in, and it can. And we don't want God to say, "I will come quickly and remove your candlestick." We don't need that. So then, children, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. And this is just plain language, right? Paul says to the Galatians, why are you going back there to be children that were cast out and are bound to lose their inheritance or their salvation? It says, but of the free. So even if you're persecuted, that's okay. We're still heirs of promise. They were still heirs of promise, even under all that persecution. And that all that means is that we'll inherit eternal salvation if we stay where we are. That's all the time that we have. I want to thank you for your time. We'll get into Galatians chapter 5. Try to get through the first 10, 15 verses. So if you'll study ahead for that. Thank you.